The road was almost empty when the flashing lights appeared behind him. Red and blue cut through the darkness, reflecting off the dusty windshield like a warning meant to intimidate. Bob Marley noticed them instantly. He did not panic. He did not look surprised. He simply took his foot off the accelerator and eased the car toward the side of the road, as if he had already accepted that this night would not pass quietly. It was the mid-1970s, a time when being black, famous, and alone at night did not make you untouchable. It made you visible, vulnerable, especially in places where authority was quick to judge and slow to listen. Bob pulled over. The engine went silent. The night air pressed in. Behind him, the police car stopped. Two armed officers stepped out. Their movements were sharp, practiced, heavy with purpose. This was not a friendly stop. It was not casual. One officer adjusted his grip on the flashlight. The other kept his hand close to his weapon. Bob stayed seated, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slow, calm on the outside, alert on the inside. The flashlight beam cut through the car window and landed on his face. It stayed there longer than necessary. The officer leaned closer, studying his hair, his skin, his expression, not looking for a violation, looking for a reason. Step out of the vehicle. Bob opened the door carefully and stepped onto the road. He stood tall, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. A kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are, even when the world tries to remind you who it thinks you should be. The officers circled him slightly. Questions followed. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Whose car is this? Each question felt less like procedure and more like pressure. Around them, there were no witnesses, no cameras, just silence and authority. One officer's voice hardened. He took a step closer, too close. Bob could smell alcohol on his breath. The other officer watched quietly, his expression unreadable. Bob answered calmly, every word measured, every movement slow. He had learned long ago that sudden gestures could change everything. He had also learned that dignity was not loud. It did not argue. It simply existed. Then one of the officers asked a question that had nothing to do with traffic. It was personal, loaded, dangerous. Bob paused for the first time. He looked at the officer, really looked at him. In that moment, Bob understood that whatever he said next would decide how this night would be remembered. As just another stop, or as something far heavier. He took a breath, and the road seemed to narrow around them. Bob's pause did not go unnoticed. The officer closest to him tilted his head slightly, as if silence itself were an act of defiance. The flashlight beam tightened on Bob's chest, then drifted back to his face. The second officer shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the asphalt. The night felt closer now, pressing in from all sides. Answer the question, the officer said. Bob finally spoke. His voice was low and even, almost gentle. He did not rush his words. He did not challenge the tone being used against him. He answered plainly, without decoration, without apology. The kind of answer that gave nothing extra to hold on to. Officer listened, but his expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened. There was something unsettling about a man who did not flinch. Fear was expected. Anger was manageable. Calm was not. Turn around, the officer said. Bob did not ask why. He turned slowly, the way someone does when they know every movement is being measured. He placed his hands where he was told. The metal of the car was cool beneath his palms. Behind him, he heard the faint click of a holster shifting, not a threat. A reminder. The search began. It was not gentle. It was not careful. Hands pressed harder than necessary. Pockets were checked. Again. The flashlight returned, tracing the outline of his body lingering on his hair. A muttered comment slipped out, low and dismissive. It was not meant for Bob to respond to. It was meant to reduce him. Bob closed his eyes for a brief second. In that darkness, memories surfaced uninvited. Crowded yards back home. The sound of children running. His mother's voice reminding him that strength did not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looked like restraint. Sometimes it looked like silence. Anything else on you we should know about? The officer asked. Bob opened his eyes. No. The second officer finally stepped closer. Until now, he had watched quietly, observing not just Bob, but his partner. His gaze lingered on Bob's face, studying it with growing curiosity. Something about the voice, the posture, the stillness. It felt familiar. Where did you say you were coming from? He asked again. Bob answered. The words were the same as before, the tone unchanged. The second officer nodded slowly. His flashlight lowered just a fraction. He looked at Bob more carefully now, not as a suspect, but as a person. The hair, the eyes, the face he had seen somewhere before, though he could not yet place it. You don't seem nervous, he said. Bob met his gaze. Should I be? The question hung in the air, heavier than anything spoken so far. The first officer turned sharply. Don't get smart. Bob said nothing. He did not need to. A car passed in the distance, headlights sweeping briefly across. The scene before disappearing again. For a moment, the world seemed to remember them, then forget them just as quickly. The second officer hesitated. Then he asked quietly, almost to himself, "What's your name?" Bob did not answer immediately. Not because he was afraid to say it, but because he understood what names could do. Names could end things. Or they could make them worse. Finally. He spoke. Bob? The officer waited. Last name? Bob looked straight ahead. His voice did not change. Marley. The silence that followed was different. Not empty. Not tense in the same way. It was the silence of recognition, beginning to form, but it had not fully arrived yet, and until it did, the danger was not over. The name settled into the night slowly, as if it needed time to find its place. Marley. The second officer's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion now, but in thought. He looked at Bob again, really looked this time, as if the darkness had been hiding something in plain sight. The dreadlocks, the calm voice, the posture that did not bend even under pressure. Pieces began to connect, but the picture was still incomplete. The first officer did not share that hesitation. He heard the name and dismissed it almost instantly. To him, it meant nothing. Or worse, it meant something he did not care to acknowledge. Never heard of you, he said, flatly. Bob said nothing. He did not correct him. He did not explain. Fame was not a shield he trusted, and this was not a moment where pride would help him. He remained still, breathing slow, eyes forward. The second officer glanced at his partner, then back at Bob. You sure about that? He asked quietly. The first officer bristled. What's that supposed to mean? It means, the second officer replied, choosing his words carefully, he looks like someone I've seen before. The tension shifted again. Not released. Redirected. The first officer stepped closer to Bob as if to reassert control. You carrying anything illegal? He asked, his voice sharper now, impatient. No, Bob answered. You sure about that? Yes. The word was soft but unshaken. The officer exhaled through his nose, irritated. He took a step back, scanning the empty road again. The silence around them felt unnatural, like the world had paused to watch. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled faintly from the police car. A voice spoke codes and locations, distant and indifferent. Second officer walked a few steps away, closer to the car, shining his flashlight inside. He checked the seats, the floor, the back. His movements were slower now, less aggressive. His mind was clearly elsewhere. "You said you make music," he said over his shoulder. "Yes." "What kind of music?" Bob hesitated just slightly. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it carried weight. Reggae. The word hung there. The second officer stopped moving. He straightened slowly. Reggae was not mainstream, not here. Not yet, but it was known, whispered about, associated with protest, with messages that made people uncomfortable. He turned back toward Bob. "You from Jamaica?" "Yes." Something changed in the officer's face. Not fear, not anger. Recognition finally crossed the line into certainty. "I've heard you on the radio," he said quietly, almost surprised by his own realization. The first officer snapped his head toward him. "What?" The second officer did not look away from Bob. "I've heard his voice." The road felt narrower than ever now. The first officer laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "You're telling me this guy's famous?" Bob remained silent. The second officer studied him for a long moment. "You're Bob Marley," he said again, this time not as a question. Bob met his eyes. "That's my name." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Fame had finally arrived at the scene, but it did not bring comfort. It brought complication. The first officer's expression tightened, not with respect, but with something closer to resentment. The power dynamic had shifted, and he felt it. "So what?" he said. "That's supposed to change something?" Bob did not answer. The second officer lowered his flashlight completely now. His voice softened, though his posture stayed professional. "It changes how this looks," he said. The first officer scoffed. "Looks fine to me, but it didn't. Not anymore." Bob felt it too. The moment had reached a fragile edge. One word, one decision, one action could push it toward escalation or release. Bob knew this was not about winning. It was about surviving the moment with his dignity intact. He had no interest in humiliating anyone, no desire to prove a point. He wanted this night to end quietly, peacefully, but the first officer was not ready to let it go. He stepped forward again. "You think because people clap for you, you're above the law?" Bob turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm. "I never said that." The officer waited, as if expecting more. "That's it," Bob added. "I never said that." The words carried no challenge, no accusation, just truth. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against all three men. The second officer looked between them, sensing the moment slipping toward something irreversible. And then he did something unexpected. He spoke, not to Bob, but to his partner. "Let's slow this down." First officer stared at him. "You serious?" "Yes," he said. "We've done what we needed to do." The night held its breath again, because what happened next would decide whether this stop became just another memory, or something neither of them would ever forget. The first officer did not respond right away. His jaw tightened as he stared at his partner, as if trying to understand when control had begun to slip from his hands. The road, the darkness, the quiet authority he carried with the uniform, all of it had always been enough before. Tonight, for the first time, it wasn't. "We haven't finished," he said finally. The second officer kept his voice level. "We've checked the car. We've asked the questions." "That's not the point," the first officer replied. "The point is respect." Bob understood that word very well. He had heard it used as a weapon his entire life. Respect was often demanded by those who had never learned how to give it. He remained still, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. He did not interrupt. He did not plead. He allowed the officers to wrestle with themselves. The second officer took a slow breath. "Respect goes both ways," he said. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. The first officer turned back to Bob, his eyes searching for something to justify his anger. "You know why we stopped you," he said. Bob shook his head gently. "No, don't play games." "I'm not," Bob replied. "I'm just telling the truth." The calmness in his voice made the moment unbearable. Anger needed resistance to survive. Bob gave it none. The second officer stepped closer to Bob now, standing slightly between him and his partner, not as a shield, but as a presence. "Where you headed tonight?" he asked. "To my hotel," Bob said. He named it quietly. The officer nodded. He knew the place. He glanced at the car again, then at the road behind them. Everything about the situation suddenly felt small, unnecessary. The first officer exhaled sharply and looked away, pacing a few steps toward the patrol car. His shoulders were tense, his movements restless. He did not like being questioned, not by his partner, not by circumstances, not by a man who refused to be intimidated. Bob watched him go, then turned his attention back to the second officer. "Don't want trouble," Bob said softly. "I just want to go home." The second officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you." That admission carried weight. The first officer returned, stopping a few feet away. He looked at Bob again, but something had changed. The fire was still there, but it flickered now, uncertain. "You got papers?" he asked. Bob reached slowly into his jacket, careful not to make sudden movements. He handed over his identification. Officer examined it longer than necessary. The second officer watched silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, the first officer handed it back. "You should be more careful," he said, "driving around late like this." Bob accepted the papers. "I am careful," he said. "That's why I stopped." Another pause. The night felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed every unspoken thought. The second officer cleared his throat. "We're done here." The first officer hesitated, then nodded once, reluctantly. He took a step back. Bob felt the shift immediately. The danger had not exploded, but it had passed. Not vanished, but receded, like a storm that chose not to break. Before Bob turned to leave, the second officer spoke again. "Your music," he said. "It matters." Bob looked at him, surprised. The officer swallowed, then continued. "It makes people think, makes them feel something." Bob held his gaze. "That's all I ever wanted." The first officer scoffed quietly, but said nothing. Bob opened his car door. He paused, then turned back, not out of obligation, but out of instinct. "Everyone's carrying something," Bob said calmly. "Some people just carry it louder than others." The words were not an attack. They were an offering. The first officer looked away. The second officer nodded slowly, as if something inside him had shifted. Bob got into his car. The engine started. The headlights cut through the darkness again. As he drove away, neither officer moved. They stood there in the quiet, watching. The taillights disappeared down the road. None of them spoke, because all three knew. This had been more than a traffic stop, but the full weight of what had happened would not be understood until later. And when it was, it would change all of them in ways they could not yet see. The story did not end on that road. For Bob Marley, the drive back to his hotel was quiet. The city lights passed by like distant thoughts, blurred and slow. He replayed the moment not with anger, but with sadness. Not for himself, but for what he had seen in the eyes of the men who stopped him. Fear, conditioning, a weight passed down so quietly it felt like truth. He did not speak about it that night. Not to his band, not to his friends. He carried it the way he carried many things, privately, letting it settle before turning it into meaning. But for the officers, the night did not fade so easily. The second officer sat in the patrol car long after Bob had gone, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. He kept hearing Bob's voice, calm and steady, not trying to win, not trying to prove anything, just existing without apology. It disturbed him more than anger ever could. He went home before dawn. He did not sleep. Days later he heard Bob Marley on the radio again, a song he had heard before but never truly listened to. This time the words felt different. They sounded like that quiet road, like restraint, like dignity under pressure. He turned the volume up and let the song finish. Then he did something he had never done before, questioned himself. Weeks passed. The first officer never mentioned the stop again, but something in him hardened further. The encounter became a story he told himself in fragments, always reshaped to protect his pride. He stayed the same. The second officer did not. He began reading, listening, paying attention. He noticed how often certain people were stopped, how often voices were raised unnecessarily, how often power was confused with righteousness. The night with Bob Marley became a mirror he could not look away from. Years later, long after Bob Marley was gone, that officer would tell his son about a musician he once stopped on a dark road. He would not tell the story as a warning. He would tell it as a lesson. He would say that real strength does not shout. That dignity can disarm hatred. That silence, when chosen, can be louder than any argument. As for Bob Marley, that night quietly shaped the work that followed. Friends noticed it in his songs, a deeper patience, a sharper clarity. His messages about injustice became firmer, not louder. He understood something most never do, that changing the world does not always happen on stages or in crowds. Sometimes it happens on empty roads. Sometimes it happens when no one is watching, and sometimes the most powerful act is refusing to become what the world expects you to be. Bob Marley was stopped by armed police that night, but what truly shocked everyone was not what the Jumadi Mamna Aneman was that night. But what truly shocked everyone was not what the Tindan Marleys was not what the Dio Chula Ifindi Juda officers did. It was what Bob Marley chose not to do. And in that restraint, in that calm humanity, lives were changed quietly, permanently, without applause. That is how legacy is made, not through domination, but through dignity.